I'm particularly happy to have this opportunity to moderate this session. Peter Dale Scott has long been a hero of mine, and I want to just say a couple of things that maybe some in the audience won't be familiar with. In addition to being, I think, one of the most profound interpreters of what he calls deep politics, which is one way of saying what is really happening in the world, but 99% of the public is unaware of it. And yet it's driving our history in dangerous and destructive directions. So it's extremely important, controversial, provocative work that he has been doing for many, many years. But in addition to that, he's one of the country's great poets who has published a three-part poem in 3 volumes called Seculum, which I highly recommend as probably, at least in my view, it is the outstanding political poem of our time, and it's a great work. The only other thing I would say about Peter is that by the criteria of the digital age, he ranks extremely high. If you look him up on Google, he has 7.9 million items. And so, so I think that's the strongest introduction one can give in the information age.
You should have put quotation marks around those 3 names. Thank you. I won't waste time by responding to that last absurd statement. I'm here to talk to you today about David Griffin on 9/11, deep politics and spirituality. And I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be part of this conference. Also, how fortunate I am to have worked with David over the years, and fortunate also most recently, while preparing for today, to have been forced to read so much, learn so much, and above all to reflect so profoundly. It's as if my whole life has flashed before me in preparing for today, because I'm going to talk about theology, and I have never talked about theology before, and I'm going to do it to a conference of theologians. Most people would not be so silly. My only qualification is that I did teach medieval literature when I was at Cal, and so all of that distant past has come up, and as I said to David, I feel that the whole of my brain has lit up on an encephalogram in preparing for today's talk. I must begin by confessing my inadequacies for this task. A year ago, when invited to participate in this event, I believed that my personal collaboration with David on another book, together with my exposure to his book, Christian Faith, meant that I knew both David and his work well enough to handle this afternoon's topic. How wrong I was. In the last 2 months, I've learned for the first time that David has written or edited no less than 38 books. No one's mentioned that number yet, I think, mostly in the cause of correcting what he sees as the twin modernist errors of atheistic materialism and mind-body dualism. Like, I am sure, other conference speakers, I am humbled by the challenge of assessing his life work in 30 minutes. I feel like the juggler in the chapel of Notre Dame. I cannot really rise to the task presented me. I can only juggle. Let me begin with what I see as some of the merits of his book, Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11. This book sees America as suffering from a spiritual sickness for which a needed remedy is truth, or, in my terms, at least an exposure of falsehoods. It's not quite the same thing. It is obviously risky to proceed in the same text from the fate of Flight 93 on 9/11 to a discussion of whether or not God created the universe out of nothing. But Griffin's Theodicy is dedicated to the two. I'm so glad that we had that brilliant exposition by Todd this morning. I'm not going to say anything about 9/11, which is what I know something about. I'm going to give you instead a freshman essay on the theology in the rest of the book. Griffin's Theodicy is dedicated to linking these two different worlds. His cosmology, like Whitehead's, is rooted in the indeterminacy, or what Griffin calls the self-determination, of all events in the universe, a vision of the world as process rather than material substance, which Whitehead seems to have taken from the initial stages of quantum theory. Griffin's summary exposition of this idea is so succinct that this is my only long quote from the book, but I love this. So when my fingers are up like this, I'm quoting. Whitehead's doctrine that all individuals embody creativity means that at least some iota of responsive, self-determining creativity, as well as some degree of outgoing causal creativity, is exercised by all events, even those in the primordial chaos. Such a view would have been ridiculed in the 19th century when science was heavily committed to a strict determinism. But since the discovery of quantum indeterminacy, this idea is not ruled out. The idea is also increasingly supported by biologists who have discovered that bacteria make decisions. Likewise, the scientist Robert Millikan, who was known as Mr. Molecule, once said that if molecules were as big as dogs, we would unhesitatingly attribute the power of decision-making to them, end quote. We often encounter the notion that God himself is part of this process of cosmic creativity, not wholly under divine control and evolving in time. But Griffin expands on the Whiteheadian notion of creativity latent in the world to see not only divine creativity, but also what Griffin calls a creaturely creativity latent in God's creatures. This latter can be good or evil. But when evil can be, quote, powerful enough to threaten divine purposes, close quote, it becomes what Griffin calls demonic. Griffin sees demonic power as both, quote, rooted in something eternal, creaturely creativity, and, unlike Augustine's view, not on a leash, rendering possible, for example, the Holocaust. By discussing the demonic in recent historical and political developments, Griffin takes his place in a tradition dating back to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's attacks on the demonic in Western civilization were first adapted by Reinhold Niebuhr into a de facto defense of the Cold War, and then expanded by Alexander Solzhenitsyn into a condemnation of East and West alike. Solzhenitsyn's warnings about Russia as demonic were in turn adapted in Reagan's Evil Empire speech into a case for American global supremacy and, quote, peace through strength, close quote. The reaction at the time of people like myself was to respond like the essayist Bernard Lee in Griffin's Sacred Interconnections, that saying empire of evil is not helpful. But more recently, many of us came to wonder if our moral equanimity was not perhaps too Laodicean in the face of today's quasi-apocalyptic events. The perplexing challenge, again shared by many, is how to be morally clear without lapsing into hatred. Here, Griffin has written something very helpful in God and Religion in the Postmodern World. Postmodern theology's doctrine of the divine attitude portrays an essentially pluralistic, multilateral world. It says that every center of experience is loved for its own sake, no center of experience is hated, and none is viewed as having only instrumental value, close quote. Similarly, I was disinclined at first to believe Griffin's Dostoevskian implication that people with the wrong notion of God are more likely to misbehave. But Griffin has helped me recognize that a culture promoting a textbook deity outside a quasi-scientific universe of inert matter, as well as shallow values of freedom and equality, is indeed more likely also to tolerate surrender to pressing impulses of greed than the quieter impulses of kindness and compassion. Thus, Griffin's Whiteheadian theology corrects this cultural sickness by envisaging a panentheistic God consistent with a scientific reality that is a creative, indeterminate, evolving process. Griffin's discussion of the divine and the demonic, of our own self-determination in a universal self-determining process, both separates and gives dimension to his chapters in Christian faith on the Roman and American empires. I accept his insight, following Richard Horsley, that, quote, understanding the nature of the Roman Empire is crucial for understanding the message of Jesus, close quote. Griffin then lists 5 features of the Roman Empire that are also exemplified by the American Empire, from, quote, the sense that the empire is divinely authorized to the collection of taxes in order to enrich the empire's center and finance its imperial rule. His exposition of the parallels is very strong and very suggestive. I am tempted to add one more comparison: the imperial weakening of an earlier civic and republican society by its breakdown into classes of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. Griffin demonstrates very well how imperialism then and now enriches the metropolitan center at the expense of the impoverished provinces or third world. But the same disparity has increased at home as well, impoverishing not only the domestic poor, but also the domestic state that once cared for them. Now I'd like to turn to what I see as some of the limitations of David's book. Griffin's comparison of the Roman and American empires is both useful and evocative. At the same time, I consider it limited as presented on 3 counts. First, it freezes both empires in time as objects, ignoring the obvious and relevant fact that both Rome and America evolved spectacularly in time from progressive republics into oppressive empires. A second point is that both nations contributed in a major way to the freedom of some, even as they also contributed to the impoverishment and virtual enslavement of others. The third point is that the differences between Rome and America are, if anything, more important than the similarities, especially when we are trying to move, as the book does, beyond reflection to action. I agree with Hegel that history as a process struggling towards emancipation, peace, and the progressive displacement of violent power by persuasive power, I agree with that. In this process, empires play a dialectical role when they are engines not just of exploitation and oppression, but also of literacy and law. The search for order motivates them as well as greed. And I think I said yesterday that you could not, it was the existence of British law that empowered Gandhi and made nonviolence possible, and the existence of American law that empowered Martin Luther King and made the success of the civil rights movement possible. I want to come back to that. And there's a third thing I would say, that it was the expansion of the Roman Empire through the Mediterranean that made Christianity a world religion, just as the Sassanid Empire preceded and made possible the rapid spread of Islam. American empire is not wholly evil. Because of it, Germany is not East Germany. South Korea is not North Korea. Cambodia has escaped from Pol Pot. But in the late stages of American empire, we have seen insane doctrines of global domination and unilateral violence. America's actions now violate the UN Charter it helped create. It is these specific actions that are evil, in my view, not empire per se. In Christian terms, I believe we should judge America's sins, not the sinner. In practical terms, America's wrongdoings are scrutable but not predictable. Invading Iraq in 2003 was a crime. Sending US forces to East Timor in 1999 was not. Will sending US forces into Uganda now prove a crime? It is too early to judge. Thus, Griffin's one-sided assessment of America explains what I consider to be the weakness of the book's final call to action. On an ethical level, it seems quite appropriate that Griffin would encourage fellow Americans to emulate the resistance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth to Hitler. But in terms of political and social action, the two theologians' example seems much less relevant. The confessing church the two men founded achieved nothing and went exactly nowhere. I much prefer Griffin's other example, the proclamation of the Lutheran World Federation in 1977 that the church had a duty to oppose apartheid in South Africa. As an example of mobilizing faith to speak in truth against evil, I much prefer the civil rights movement of the 1960s, guided by heroic churchmen like Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin Luther King. But King is mentioned only once in the book, and even then not as a role model. The reason why would seem to be obvious and symptomatic. King's political agenda, like Gandhi's before him, was to appeal to what was good in government and society against what was evil. But what is good in American society and government is not discussed in Griffin's book. In practice, of course, Griffin is constantly appealing to the good in American society, and I have to insert a footnote here. I wrote to David and said, why do you mention King so rarely in your books? Because it's a recurring thing that you don't see much about King. And he wrote back with an attachment saying, well, I have this 4,000-word essay, but I never got to publish it. It was all about Martin Luther King. And we have to realize that if David is finite, it's not because his mind doesn't go certain places, it's just he doesn't have the time to follow up on all the vistas that his work opens up. Anyway, I say in practice, Griffin is constantly appealing to the good in American society. What he's doing is an appeal to the good in American society. And to give only one relevant example, the civil rights movement was ecumenical, and Griffin, 1 year before Christian Faith, edited this other important volume, Deep Religious Pluralism, we heard about this morning. The word ecumenical is absent in Christian Faith, but only because the book is explicitly designed for a narrow purpose to inspire Christian churches to take up the issue of 9/11. I mention this only to illustrate that Griffin's overall contribution to the topic of spirituality and the truth of 9/11 on every level goes far beyond the measure of this single book. And now I have what I would consider a necessary digression on Griffin and Merton on the demonic in politics, or what I, in my subtitle, call the apodeictic versus the apophatic. Before leaving Christian faith, I would like to refer to the absence in it of Thomas Merton, another great theologian who once described American imperial policies as demonic. Griffin's call to reflect on the church community and demonic power would seem to echo Merton on the moral passivity of Christians in the face of demonic activism. Both men saw America's willingness to contemplate a nuclear first strike as proof of a demonic force in American government. But their respective theologies are dramatically opposed. Griffin's approach to the conundrum of God and evil is to explain it in a series of carefully argued conclusions that are almost Euclidean. Merton, by contrast, especially in his later life, spoke of God as ineffable and evil as unspeakable. Merton's mature approach to God became characterized by what is called apophatic insight, an approach by negation to a realm of unknowing beyond words. Merton inspired James Douglas's important and relevant book, JFK and the Unspeakable. In some ways, his book is like Griffin's, but on one central point, it is different. Douglas sees the JFK assassination as an act inflicted against the state by an element within it. Griffin also blames such an element for 9/11, as when he concludes, for example, quote, that members of the Bush administration and the U.S. military orchestrated the attacks of 9/11, and they did so to advance their imperial aims, close quote. But Griffin also speaks repeatedly, as we heard this morning, about what he calls, quote, the prima facie case that the Bush administration, rather than members of it, orchestrated the attacks of 9/11, and the subtitle to another of his book about state crimes against democracy reflects the same pointing of a finger at the state itself. In other words, where Douglas targets a demonic enemy within the state, Griffin sometimes attributes demonic evil to the American empire itself. This simple condemnation is supported by Griffin's heavy reliance on structuralist epitomes of American wrongdoings by monochromatic writers like Noam Chomsky, an explicit anarchist, and Bill Blum. By the way, that doesn't matter. Furthermore, when Merton and Douglas are trying to deal with a mystery, Griffin often writes as if the mystery has been solved. For example, he writes of the demonstrable cover-up in the 9/11 Commission report, and there's no dispute about that. It is a cover-up, as, quote, a decisive event, the moment at which the prima facie case against the Bush administration became his emphasis, conclusive case. But in my opinion, the predictable shortcomings of the 9/11 Commission report prove very little more than that an initial cover-up was still being defended. It remains unclear to me whether this cover-up was to protect officials inside the Bush administration, allies like Saudi Arabia outside of it, or, as I suspect, some combination of the two. To conclude, I applaud Griffin for courageously, and I have to emphasize that word, courageously, investigating the mystery of 9/11, but I cannot agree that he has solved it. And now I come to this section, knowing, unknowing, and deep politics, confessions of an ignorant juggler. It is a mark of Griffin's open-mindedness and generosity that he invited me to be here today. He knows that I do not endorse hard-edged and one-sided condemnations of the American empire or explanations of 9/11. Both in my prose and my poetry, I have repeatedly attacked monochromatic assessments of America's foreign influence. I do see an evil force at work in America, and recently I have reproved myself, perhaps learning from David, for having been too reluctant in the past to use the term evil. But to see evil in the American empire is very different from Griffin's flat judgment that, quote, the American empire is evil, close quote. Griffin sees nothing particularly mysterious about 9/11. I, in contrast, believe that it was one of a series of what I call structural deep events of the sort I have defined elsewhere as, quote, mysterious events like the JFK assassination, the Watergate break-in, or 9/11, which violate the American social structure, have a major impact on American society, repeatedly involve law-breaking or violence, and in many, perhaps most cases, proceed from an unknown dark force. With the passage of time, evidence about these events accumulates, but even so, mysteries remain. Thus, for example, I regard both Tonkin Gulf and 9/11 as deep events in which the question of ultimate causality and responsibility remains obscure. I see them as arising out of the murky substrate of deep politics, which I see in all superstates with a surplus of power over what is needed for the security of their domestic society. I do, however, conclude that such surplus power is likely to lead to atrocities like 9/11, and that these atrocities are repeatedly not the work of the public state itself, but committed against the legal structure of the public state. This recurring phenomenon, wherein part of the state acts against the public state as a whole, is what I have tried to explain as a dark force or deep state within, beyond, and above all against the public state. Griffin's explanation, in contrast, tends to ignore such duality. Thus, David's political analysis of deep events is different from my deep political analysis. But the difference in our approach is symptomatic of a deeper difference in our approach to language and its limits, and indeed in our approach to God. And here I'm going to spare you pages in the longer version, whole pages. I'll just say, Thomas Merton and I both became poets, believing, as we do, that, as Czesław Miłosz once suggested, language is like a bird thrashing against a glass window pane in a vain attempt to reach the realm of truth beyond it. Where's my water here? Clearly, David is wired differently. Where I am more likely to admit ignorance in the face of a mystery, he is more likely to seek out a truth to be unraveled, as we discussed this morning. As a result, there is a difference in tone between us when we write about 9/11. More importantly, and in the same spirit, there is a difference in tone between us when we write about God. It was predictable that I, as a poet, would have trouble accepting Griffin's hard-edged essentialist definition of the American empire as evil. The argument between Griffin and myself, between the apodeictic and the apophatic, is deep, indeed, about God, but it is also esoteric, and above all, it is a dispute between friends. Now my final section, spanning 9/11 and spirituality, the overall achievement of David Ray Griffin. The main point of this talk is that the dimensions of Griffin's contributions to spirituality and politics go far beyond the range of his book, Christian Faith. Together with John Cobb and Catherine Keller, and with assistance from his close friend Richard Falk, Griffin has devoted a lifetime to consolidating a postmodern spiritual Weltanschauung, one grounded in a community of postmodern theologians and others with a collective post-imperial vision. They saw, long before 9/11, that the modern world was both in an age of spiritual crisis and also striving towards a more peaceful and communitarian age to succeed it. Griffin did not just embody this thinking in his own writings, he assembled a number of like-minded thinkers from different faiths in a prodigious series of volumes he edited. He thus helped energize a realm of postmodern spiritual discourse, and in so doing became a spiritual leader long before 9/11. His long experience with unpretentious leadership carried over easily into the 9/11 truth movement. His graciousness, meticulous honesty, and let me add wisdom, I should have put that in there too, and wisdom have made him, of all the 9/11 critics, the most likely to gain access to the mainstream media. However, these qualities have not protected him from a flood of attacks ranging from the severe to the deranged, even an attack from the Westminster Press that published one of his books. Here I cannot ignore the fact that some aspects of Griffin's 9/11 research have been criticized even within the 9/11 movement by researchers whom I consider responsible. But this has little bearing on the subject I am discussing today, especially when you consider there are probably no two critics of 9/11 who can agree on anything anyway. I would rather close with the judgment that, in my opinion, David Ray Griffin is a great man. We see in the world today a retreat from the high tide of secularism that engulfed the 19th century, and Griffin has helped illuminate the cosmological and theological dimensions of that retreat, and indeed the political dimensions. In addition, he is also a leader in the movement for truth about America, having to deal with all the special difficulties that fame and leadership can bring. His qualities of modesty, compassion, and good humor have been of great benefit to those of us who know him, and in a larger way to all his embattled followers who are dedicated to the cause of 9/11 truth as a path towards greater peace and understanding in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. He began by saying he was going to write a freshman essay. How many of it would we not have loved to have freshmen like him? With regard to just something you said at the beginning, that I was battling against atheistic materialism and mind-body dualism, it's probably presupposed in what you say, but the other thing is classical theism. So that goes with mind-body dualism, usually, but that's a big issue. Okay, the Roman and American empires, do I freeze them in time? Maybe in my very brief characterization, it sounds like that, but certainly not in thought. And one of the things that hasn't been frozen in time are our freedoms. And just in the last 10 years, since 9/11, our freedoms are in great under threat. And laws have been passed already that would allow almost any of us to be thrown into prison on the say-so of a single person. No judge, no jury, no... It's just if the president says, you're an enemy of the state, you're an enemy of the state. That's it. I wish it had been frozen in time. Now, you say that American empire is not wholly evil. I would want to make a division here between America and sometimes you speak as if I speak of America as wholly evil. I would want to say the American empire is largely evil. Yeah, I mean, empires tend to be evil because of their monopoly on power and all those other factors we were talking about. Now, if I were writing a book, another of the books I've threatened to write, if I were calling it America, Divine or Demonic, and that's a title I've been playing with for many years, then yes, I would have to give a balanced approach to the good side of America, which people do have called divine, and not emphasize only the demonic side of America. But that was not the book I was writing. I was speaking about the American empire, American imperialism, and yes, I want to say that's largely evil. And I also don't want to say that it's just recently, as you suggested, that we have developed some insane policies. Certainly they're more insane than before, but you know what was going on during Vietnam. You know what has gone on in various countries in the world that the CIA has gotten involved in and overthrown governments. You know, there's a pretty mainstream book now just called Overthrow, giving all the empires, all the countries, generally democratically elected countries, overthrown by the American empire over the last particularly 70 years. Now, this question about is it 9/11 caused by the Cheney administration or just by certain members of that? You're right that I'm not always consistent on that. I just speak carelessly about that and sometimes say the members and sometimes say the empire. Well, if you've got the leaders of administration doing it, I don't see much of a distinction between saying certain members of the administration, such as Bush, Cheney, and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the CIA and the FBI, and the National Security Advisor, and so on. I don't see much difference between saying that those members were guilty and the Bush administration was responsible. And then the other factor, of course, is the media. And it appeared that the media was not in on it at the beginning, at least in some respects, because the first day of 9/11, we got a lot of honest reporting of what went on with the Twin Towers and even Building 7. The very next day, a total absence of those stories. So you never again saw Building 7 come down like that. That is almost, is to anybody with knowledge of these things proof that it was an inside job. And the media went along very easily, evidently, with that. We don't know what's the backstory. But when you talk about all that, it's hard to say how can we make a distinction there. Now, the murkiness of making judgments about who was responsible. Certainly there are all sorts of things we don't know about. For example, we believe we know that the buildings were brought down by explosives of some sort. We do not know exactly what those explosives were. We don't know what combination was used, probably. We don't know how they got them in the buildings and so on. All sorts of things we're ignorant about. But I would say we know the basic thing, the central thing, that it was an inside job. And so that's all that's really important, to talk about the need for a genuine investigation into those events of that day. Now, you make a distinction between the public state and the deep state. You say this is not the public state doing this, the public state with its legal structure, but that it's the deep state acting against the public state. And here we probably need to talk some more for me to understand exactly what you mean, but it sounds like to me that you're saying the public state by definition is legal. So anything that's done against it would be the deep state working against the public state. But again, I have to ask, if we're talking about the president, the vice president, and so on down the list, how do we make much of a distinction between the public state and the deep state? Of course, the public state is making public statements and saying, here's the truth, and they're doing all the ceremonial things and all that are part of being the public state. But in terms of the actions, who's actually in charge of the events, it's hard for me to see a distinction, an important distinction. Finally, just a qualification about the Westminster Press. And those of you who don't know, I do have a whole chapter on it in the latest book. 9/11, 10 years later. Todd knows what I've written. There's a chapter in there where I tell the story about why my book, Christian Faith, the truth about 9/11. It was denounced by my own publisher. So Westminster, John Knox Press, published the book and then turned around and denounced it. Well, how could you explain that? Well, here's a place where we have to make a distinction between the deep structure. Yeah. So, by the Westminster Press, we mean the president, the vice president in charge of publications. So they're the ones that authorized my book to be published. But standing behind them is an organization composed of 5 people. I think I can say 5 guys, I'm not sure. And it's the publication, can you call the name, John? But the Publication Corporation, that's what it is, the Presbyterian Publication Corporation. And as I'm told, they made a vote of 3-2, and that the chairperson of the committee cast the vote. And on the basis of that, they started micromanaging Westminster Press. And they kept saying in their stories, we're not, we've always given them complete freedom, complete autonomy. Well, no, they went in and started micromanaging. And so the president couldn't stand it. And so when he got an offer to go elsewhere, he went elsewhere. The next day, the vice president for publications, who at one time had been a student here at Claremont, was fired. And so that's, in that sense, the Westminster Press rejected its own book. And the interesting thing was, as has been made, and John made the reference, that I've made all sorts of statements and that the Westminster Press has published, that they never had any problem with my rejections of Calvinism and my rejections of the supernaturalist view of Christology and all those things. No problem whatsoever. But then when I talk about 9/11 was an inside job, that America was not perfect, or America was capable of criminal activity. The American, whether we call the deep state infiltrated or the public state, that was it. So that's the story behind why Christian faith and the truth behind the 9/11. They still let the book be published, but they do not promote it in any of their things. So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for your patience.
I want to do it very briefly with 2 points. First of all, how can I distinguish between the Bush-Cheney administration and the top level of people in it? I would refer to what almost happened in 2007, when many of us believed, and I think rightly, that America was on the point of backing an Israeli attack on Iran at that time. And this was so serious that even people who are normally my enemy, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, warned publicly against this. It was clear that Cheney and Rumsfeld and a whole bunch of people, Faith, Libby, we could name the names, they wanted this very badly. And it didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was that, well, it was partly the, I think, 2006 election in which the Bush administration lost control of the House. But Rumsfeld resigned, and the ship of state sailed on. The president, I think, was not part of that cabal. And I'm not at all convinced that the president was part of the cabal in 2001. I think they had to make sure he was down in a schoolhouse in Florida while the people who were running things took over. So that's, if I'm true that it was important that Bush be out of the Capitol, then it suggests there is a difference. And just very quickly on Building 7, you're absolutely right in your devastating critique of the official story. But when you say an inside job, who are you pointing at? It might be Mr. Silverstein, who owned the building. I think we have to entertain the possibility that there are 3 plots on 9/11. First of all, the plot to make it look like an Arab attack on America. Secondly, a plot to get those planes to go into the buildings, which is prodigious. I myself believe there was robotic control of those planes, whether there were Saudis on the planes or not. They were steered elsewhere. And thirdly, I'm not sure that the people who designed the first 2 had any idea that the buildings were going to collapse. All 3 of them. It's immensely profitable to Mr. Silverstein. But that could have been his little plot on top of another plot. So to say that 9/11 it's an inside job because of what happened to Building 7 doesn't necessarily link back to what was happening in the White House.
Richard, I'm sorry, I just got to make a brief...
And I promise not to respond.
Okay. George Bush, was he responsible 9/11, or was he out of the picture? At one time, I thought maybe that's likely, and maybe he was down there so that he was out of the way, and Cheney clearly was in charge. And of course, Cheney had been the head of the Secretary of Defense, so he knew all about that stuff. I thought that, but recently we have a new website called Consensus 9/11, and we're just, I think this week, putting in a whole bunch of things, and it shows that everybody in a central role on 9/11 who could have done false stories about them. And one reason or another that they weren't there, or they claimed they weren't there, or whatever. So the fact that Bush was not there, I don't think says anything about whether. So I'm still, I agree, I'm somewhat agnostic about him, but I've moved over to the other side. But certainly Cheney and Rumsfeld, no doubt about that. Silverstein, yes, a more complete thing, and I read about this, that to have this operation, you would have to have all sorts of help. So you had to have people doing the stuff in New York, did stuff in the Pentagon. Those would be completely different, except the flights. And the flights had to be coordinated. The flights had to be, where they hit the buildings, where they hit, the time they hit them, that was precisely coordinated with the buildings coming down, making it look like they were coming down. So those couldn't be just completely independent operations. They had to be coordinated, but of course with different people on the ground in different locations. So yes, I'd still go back to say that is an inside job done in an overall way, not a bunch of cowboys doing things independently. Okay, thanks.